Hi, my name is Gabrielle Gross, and I'm currently attending Eleanor Roosevelt High School. I'm an African-American girl who has lived in the United States my whole life. During the time in Miss Laura's class, I was able to identify three themes that apply to me in my life. This includes slavery and its legacy, which focuses on the pattern of long-term resistance and on free labor after slavery was abolished in the U.S. The second theme is American diversity, which is the acceptance of a person's characteristics and personality, meaning their race, gender, ethnicity, or anything else that describes who a person is. The last theme is reform, which focuses on all the different movements in the past that were based on a broad range of issues with the nation and social rights. Based on my study of U.S. history, I want to be the type of American citizen that grows from slavery by treating others with respect, doesn't discriminate or judge any person because of their looks, and stands up for equal rights and other issues that tie into discrimination. In my study of U.S. history, I want to be the type of American citizen that grows from slavery by treating others with respect rather than pondering on the past and continuing to make the same mistakes. After slavery ended, slave owners still believed that they weren't in the wrong. One former slave owner, Henry Ravenel, expressed this in one of his diary entries. In his diary, he stated that, "How can they support themselves at present? I cannot see. If emancipation prevails, the Negro must become labor in the field, as the whites will soon occupy all the domestic and mechanic employments." This trend refers back to the Black Codes, where white Southerners enforced laws to make sure that they maintained same level of power and authority as they did in the past. Another system that they enforced out of fear of losing power was sharecropping. Sharecropping enforces the unfree labor upon the blacks because they were each given their own land and materials for agriculture and to make enough money to pay for the land. In the end, they were supposed to keep a small share of their harvest and money, while the rest goes to the landowner. However, the truth was that the Americans did all the work, but in the end, they didn't get much out of it. The way that Southerners took advantage of African Americans is the opposite of how I want to be when I grow up. As for Native Americans, eventually most of them were driven on reservations and forced to take on farming. They were each given their own share of land to farm on. This was because of the Dawes Act. An explanation of the Dawes Act is included that the land allotted to the Indians include desert or near desert lands unsuitable for farming. The trend proves that the Native Americans were forced into harsh living conditions after being forced out of their own land. To make matters even worse, the Indian children were put into boarding schools where they were stripped of their culture. I am against the way that the Native Americans were being treated just because the settlers went for lands and ores. The way that the Native Americans were treated referred back to slavery and how cruel a white race was to others. Shows how after slavery ended, it left a giant mark in society that no one made any effort to correct. Rather, people continued to make the same negative interactions and actions as before. The type of American citizen I want to be is someone kind and caring to others, no matter who they are and because of their past. A final example of how slavery left its legacy was during progressive times. During that time, it wasn't the different races that were treated poorly, it was more the different classes. A muckraker named Jacob Riis wrote an article called How the Other Half Lives, which explains the living conditions of the poorest of the poor. In an excerpt of How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis describes how some of certain apology for bread with the mattress and blanket represents the aristocratic purchase of a tramp who, by lucky stroke or beggary, has exchanged the chance of an empty box or an ash barrel for shelter on the quality floor of one of these hotels. This trend shows how he's being sarcastic about the living conditions of the poor. Muckraking is all about exposing the lies and dirty secrets of American society. What Riis exposed was the truth of the living conditions of the poor, including the prices of shared room for one night and the descriptions of the appearance inside one of the tenements. I appreciate the idea of informing the rest of society about the hidden lies and secrets that others have to experience and live with. If I was one of those people who are better off in that time, I would have made an effort to try to make a positive change. I aspire to do the same in the future for any problem that I have the opportunity to help resolve. To be the American citizen that doesn't discriminate or judge a person because of who they are, no matter their race, class, ethnicity, gender, etc. In the past, the way that one person treated another depended on individual's race or class for the most part. Occasionally, women face discrimination because of their gender. As for African Americans, they were still forced into various types of unfree labor and deprived of many rights. One example of these types of labor that blacks face, as stated in Mississippi Black Codes, that provided as an apprentice shall be bound by indenture, in case of males until they're 21 years old, in case of females until they're 18 years old. This trend started in 1866 when Congress passed a discrimination law created by Southern states to restrict African American lives. This law was called Black Codes. Southern states enforced this law because they wanted to retain the same amount of power that they had as slave owners. They had to be cautious not to be unconstitutional with their actions now that the 14th Amendment was passed, stating that no state can deny a citizen their rights or privileges, but in the end they managed to bend the law a bit, especially since Andrew Johnson became president and was more lenient with the white Southerners than former President Abraham Lincoln. I'm against this kind of treatment because all of us are human. Instead, when I grow up, I'm going to make sure that everyone is treated as an equal no matter their race. No one should be deprived of their rights. Another incident in history was when the Native Americans were driven out of their own land onto reservations because of the settlers' greed for riches and land. In the source Sitting Bull, it explains the life and reaction of a Native American tribe leader named Sitting Bull towards the settlers' harsh and cruel actions. Text explains that it was during this period that Sitting Bull formed his resolve to keep his people away from the white man's world and never signed a treaty that would force them to live on a reservation with other Sioux leaders. He soon took his followers to the pristine valleys of Powder and Yellowstone River, where buffalo and other game was abundant. This trend also proves that settlers had no respect for other races. Instead of discussing compromise with the Native Americans for the land, they declare war on the Indians. Their iconic battle was the Wounded Knee Massacre, where on December 15, 1890, the soldiers of the U.S. Army invaded Lakota Indian Territory and murdered approximately 300 of them. This includes women, men, and children. While the U.S. Army was continuously battling the Indians, they would force the tribes onto reservations and strip them of their culture. Now that I've learned about how greed and immense want for things you don't have can cause you to become cruel to others, I realized that I want to be a non-judgmental citizen. It is better to try to make an agreement or compromise rather than use force. A final example of how the past lacked American diversity is during the period where African Americans were deciding whether Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois was the better leader. During this time, Booker T. Washington wrote a book called Up From Slavery. In the book, in the section Atlantic Compromise, it talks about how blacks and whites should get along. To emphasize this, Booker T. Washington includes that, as I remember now, the thing that was uppermost in my mind was the desire to say something that would cement the friendship of the races and bring about hearty cooperation between them. The trend started as a way to get the two races to collaborate with each other. The only negative impact on Washington's efforts was that he was okay of how badly African Americans were being treated around that time. Many restrictions and laws were enforced to make sure that blacks could barely access citizenship rights. One example is racial etiquette, which was enforced solely to humiliate blacks and make it so that whites were in higher society and deserved immense amount of respect from blacks. Washington also happened to be pro-segregation, meaning that he was okay with the concept of segregation. From what I learned on how Booker T. Washington tried to help the acceptance of diversity, I also learned that if I was trying to make a positive change when it comes to American diversity, I would make sure that I'll be benefiting everyone else and not allowing one group to be taken advantage of by the other, whether it's because of race, gender, or any other differences. In the end, everyone is special, no matter their difference, especially in the color of their skin. Based on my study of U.S. history, I want to be the type of American citizen who stands up for equal rights and other issues that tie into discrimination. After slavery ended, many people made an effort to try to reform America to promote changes in American society. One of these changes made were how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were enforced by Congress to make sure everyone was treated as an equal and weren't deprived of their rights. The 15th Amendment enforced the concept of free voting rights for all citizens. 15th Amendment states that the right of citizens of the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This trend shows that every person who is identified as a U.S. citizen has the right to vote, no matter who they are. This follows the 14th Amendment, which makes sure that they weren't denying the citizens privileges or rights. Both amendments prove that there is some type of change in the way society accepts people. The 15th Amendment is somewhat enforcing the foundation of future acceptance of the American diversity. I agree with the way Congress is attempting to make a change in society, especially since the change was proven to be beneficial to the majority of the nation, not just higher class. In the future, I would make sure that I abide by the amendments and also make sure that I'm not being denied my rights or privileges as an American citizen. Another attempt of reform in the past was around the time U.S. began to expand westward, forcing Native Americans out of their territories. During westward expansion, the settlers started constructing railroads to make transportation of people and goods easier. This infuriated the Native Americans greatly, so much that it led to the Battle of Beecher's Island on September 17th to 25th in 1868. An excerpt titled Battle of Beecher's Island explains the reaction of Native Americans towards the construction of the railroads. Western Indians, in a rage over the advancing railroads, had wiped out teams of railway workers. This kind of throws off the trend because even though the settlers were trying to make their attempts at reformation, they did invade the territory of the Native Americans with military force and without the consent of Indians. The true cause of westward expansion was when the U.S. started to reform the nation and needed farming space, so they took over the land in the West. Soon they found out that the land that they had conquered had gold. This started the gold rush, which caused the Americans to become more greedy for land. The news of gold spread, which leads to the mining boom in 1858. Eventually, one thing leads to another, and the Americans need an easier way to travel and transport things from east to west. This is where a railroad comes to play. Even though Americans were doing this to reform the economy, they are also affecting Indians in negative ways. From all the drama and conflict that reform causes, I know that if we're not cautious when making change, the same thing can happen. It could be as simple as in school. If I'm not cautious, many problems and dramas can arise. This is why I aspire to be a considerate American when it comes to change. One last example of reform in the past was when there was a shortage of valuable ores to base the U.S. currency off, and a conflict of what the monetary system will be to replace the true value of U.S. currency. One person who participated in this immense debate was William Jenkins Bryan, who did the speech called Cross the Gold speech. In this speech, he stated that having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world supported by the commercial interests and laboring interests of toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for the gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down on the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. This trend shows that William Jenkins Bryan is particularly against the gold standard, which is the backing of U.S. dollars solely on gold, because this system will only benefit the rich in the long run. Bimetallism is no different from the gold standard because it uses a lot of gold and silver for each paper currency. He wanted the monetary system to be equal for everyone, so he preferred the cross of gold system over everything else. This shows that he is one with the people, meaning that he spoke for the citizens who don't have the opportunity to do so. Very few leaders in the world think about what the people want, and I want to be an American citizen that thinks about others and their opinion.